The certified letter trembled in Karen's manicured hands as she stood frozen on her porch. $3 million, the number seemed to mock her from the legal document, each zero a testament to her spectacular downfall. Her usually perfect composure cracked like thin ice, and for the first time in her reign as HOA president, Karen Peton looked genuinely terrified. Let me rewind to 6 months ago, when life on my 30-acre ranch was still peaceful. My name's David, and I'd owned Cedar Ridge Ranch for 15 years. The crown jewel of my property was a 12-acre private lake, stocked with base and surrounded by willows. It was my slice of heaven, until Karen moved into our rural community and somehow got herself elected HOA president. Karen was the type who wore power suits to community barbecues and carried a clipboard everywhere like it was a scepter. Within weeks of her election, she started making waves. First came the new rules about fence colors, then regulations about livestock noise. But when she set her sights on my lake, that's when things got interesting. It started innocently enough. Karen showed up one Saturday morning with her fiancé, Brad, a real estate developer who drove a chrome-wrapped Tesla. She said sweetly that the HOA board wanted to discuss community lake access. I politely reminded her it was private property, not community-owned. Her smile tightened like a violin string about to snap. The next week, I found Karen hosting an HOA meeting at my lake's pavilion, which I'd built for family gatherings. 20 people sat there while she gestured at my water like she owned it. When I confronted her, she claimed the pavilion was on the property line and therefore fair game. It wasn't, and my survey proved it, but Karen just smiled and said we'd discuss it at the next board meeting. Things escalated quickly after that. One morning, I woke to hammering and found contractors building a floating dock. Karen stood there supervising, telling them exactly where her fiancé wanted his jet skis stationed. When I demanded they stop, she pulled out a manila folder and waved some papers at me, claiming the HOA had authority over all water features in the community. I called the sheriff, but Karen had been clever. She'd waited until I was out of town to file an emergency HOA resolution claiming the lake as community property due to something called the Common Area Precedent Clause. It was complete nonsense, but it bought her time while the lawyers sorted it out. The contractors kept coming. Next was a boathouse, then a beach area with imported sand. Karen even installed a gate with a combination lock, giving the code only to her inner circle. When other neighbors asked to fish, she'd tell them the lake was under renovation, for everyone's safety. Meanwhile, Brad threw parties every weekend, his music echoing across what used to be my peaceful water. The turning point came when I confronted them during one of Brad's gatherings. 50 people were there, none of whom I'd authorized. Karen stood on my dock in a white sundress, champagne flute in hand, looking like she'd won the lottery. When I told her to leave, she laughed with a tinkling sound that made my teeth hurt. She announced to everyone that I was a bitter old man trying to hoard community resources. Brad stepped forward, all 6 feet of spray-tanned arrogance, and put his hand on my shoulder. He said in a patronizing tone that I needed to learn to share, that Karen had gifted him usage rights as an engagement present, and maybe I should consider moving somewhere more suited to hermits. The crowd laughed nervously, unsure whose side to take. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I dove deep into property records, HOA bylaws, and county documents. What I found made my blood run cold. Karen hadn't just filed a resolution. She'd actually submitted a fraudulent easement to the county clerk, forging my signature and claiming I'd agreed to transfer lake rights to the HOA in exchange for reduced dues. The notary seal was fake, the witness signatures fabricated. The next morning, I was at my lawyer's office before they opened. Janet Morrison, a property law specialist with 30 years of experience, took one look at the documents and whistled low. She said, "This wasn't just HOA overreach, it was criminal fraud." We spent the day building our case, gathering evidence, and preparing for war. The cease and desist letter was hand-delivered to Karen during an HOA board meeting. I'll never forget the way her face drained of color as she read it. She tried to maintain composure, telling the board it was just a misunderstanding that would be cleared up, but her voice shook, and Brad's confident smirk began to falter. Karen's response was to double down. She sent me a letter on HOA letterhead stating that any legal action against HOA board members would result in special assessments for all homeowners to cover defense costs. It was a threat designed to turn neighbors against me, but it backfired. People started asking questions about why she needed defense funds for a simple property dispute. When Karen ignored the cease and desist, Janet filed the lawsuit, $3 million for property damage, trespassing, fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and punitive damages. The complaint was 60 pages of meticulously documented violations, complete with photos of the unauthorized construction and copies of the forged documents. Karen was served at her engagement party. The process server told me later that she'd laughed at first, thinking it was a prank. Then she'd read the amount and dropped her champagne glass. It shattered on her marble patio, the sound ringing like a bell marking the end of her reign. Her lawyer was a discount attorney who specialized in traffic tickets, completely out of his depth. At the first hearing, he tried to argue that HOA presidents had broad authority to interpret community needs. The judge, Harold Brennan, was not amused. He'd reviewed the forged documents and asked Karen directly if she'd filed them. She tried to deflect, saying she'd acted in good faith based on her interpretation of HOA guidelines. The trial was swift and brutal. Janet presented evidence like a conductor leading a symphony of destruction. Survey maps proved the lake was entirely on my property. Bank records showed Karen had used HOA funds to pay for the construction. The forged documents were examined by a handwriting expert who confirmed the signatures were fake. The worst moment for Karen came when Brad was called to testify under oath. He admitted Karen had promised him the lake as an engagement gift and that he'd already been marketing it to potential clients for his development company. He threw her under the bus completely, claiming he'd been deceived about the legal status of the property. When Karen took the stand, she tried to spin a story about community improvement and shared resources. She claimed I was selfish, that the lake had been abandoned and underutilized. But when Janet asked her about the forged signatures, Karen's story fell apart. She stammered, contradicted herself, and finally claimed she didn't recall the specific documents. Judge Brennan's ruling was devastating. He found Karen liable for all charges, awarded me the full $3 million in damages, and referred the forgery matter to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. He also issued a permanent injunction barring Karen from setting foot on my property and ordered all structures to be removed at her expense. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the amount, $3 million. Karen's knees buckled, and she had to grab the defendant's table for support. Her perfectly styled hair seemed to wilt, and tears streaked her designer makeup. When the judge asked if she understood the ruling, she could only nod, her voice completely gone. As the bailiff announced court adjourned, Karen turned to look at me. The supreme confidence that had defined her was shattered, replaced by the hollow stare of someone watching their entire world collapse. Brad was already walking away, his phone pressed to his ear, probably calling his lawyer about breaking their engagement. The last thing I heard was Karen's whispered words to her attorney, asking how someone could lose everything over a lake, and his blunt response that fraud tends to have consequences. The criminal charges came down 2 weeks later. Karen was arrested at her home and charged with felony forgery, facing up to 5 years in prison and another $200,000 in fines. She stood in her doorway as the officers read her rights, still wearing her HOA president blazer like armor that had failed to protect her. The HOA emergency meeting happened that same evening. Word of Karen's arrest had spread through the community like wildfire. The recreation center was packed, with standing room only. Karen's vice president, Michael Torres, called the meeting to order with obvious reluctance. He'd been her biggest supporter, but now he looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The motion to remove Karen from the board was swift and unanimous. Even her former allies voted against her, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal. When the results were announced, someone in the back actually applauded before catching themselves. The board also voted to audit all HOA finances and reverse every decision Karen had made regarding my lake. I heard from neighbors that Karen tried to enter the meeting halfway through, apparently out on bail. The security guard, following the restraining order, turned her away. She stood in the parking lot, screaming about conspiracies and jealous neighbors, until her lawyer physically dragged her to his car. Several people filmed it, and the videos went viral in our local community groups. The next bombshell came from Karen's employer. She'd been a senior manager at a property management company, a job she'd frequently leveraged to intimidate neighbors with her supposed expertise. When news of her fraud charges reached them, they launched an internal investigation. Turns out, she'd been using her work email to coordinate the lake seizure and had even tried to bill some of the construction costs to her employer as community improvements. She was terminated immediately, losing her $70,000 salary and benefits. The company also announced they were reviewing all properties she'd managed for similar schemes. Her professional license was suspended pending the criminal trial, effectively ending her career in property management forever. Brad's exit was particularly brutal. He didn't just break off the engagement, he sued her for the return of the ring and damages to his business reputation. His development company had already printed marketing materials featuring exclusive lake access that he now couldn't deliver. He claimed Karen's fraud had cost him 3 major clients who no longer trusted his judgment. The demolition of the illegal structures was scheduled for a month later. Karen was required to pay for it, but with her assets frozen and legal bills mounting, she had to take out a massive loan against her house. The day the crews arrived, she sat in her car at the edge of my property, just outside the restraining order distance, watching her fairy tale dock and boathouse get torn apart piece by piece. When the foreman handed me the final invoice to forward to Karen's lawyer, the total was staggering. Between removal, restoration, and disposal fees, it came to $97,000. Combined with the $3 million judgment and her mounting legal fees, Karen's total financial destruction exceeded $4 million. The criminal trial was set for 6 months out. Karen's lawyer filed motion after motion, trying to delay, but Judge Patricia Vega denied them all. The prosecutor, armed with my evidence and the HOA's financial records, built an ironclad case. They'd found 12 instances of forged documents, not just related to my lake but to other HOA business Karen had conducted. 3 days before the trial, I saw Karen at the grocery store. She was buying generic brands, her designer clothes replaced by worn jeans and a faded sweatshirt. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away, but not before I saw the defeat written across her face. The woman who'd once strutted through our community like royalty now shuffled through the aisles like a ghost. Her house went on the market that week, priced for a quick sale. The realtor sign looked particularly ironic next to the HOA violation notice for her overgrown lawn, a standard she'd once enforced with vindictive pleasure. Neighbors reported she was living in her basement, having rented out the upper floors to cover legal expenses. On the day of her criminal sentencing, the courtroom was packed. Karen stood before Judge Vega, her voice barely audible as she pleaded guilty to avoid a harsher sentence. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in prison, with 2 years suspended, meaning she'd serve 1 year behind bars, plus 5 years probation and $200,000 in fines. As the bailiff approached with handcuffs, Karen's legs gave out completely. She sobbed uncontrollably, begging the judge for house arrest instead, claiming she'd lose everything if she went to prison. Judge Vega's response was ice cold as she reminded Karen that fraud has consequences and that she'd already lost everything through her own criminal actions. The last image was Karen being led away in handcuffs.